This tutorial is going to be about creating a mock-up of a rigid box structure. I'm going to use this as an example. This is going to be for a relatively high-end watch brand. I kind of made up this brand. I called it Time and Place. So the design of the structure has the functionality, but what we're doing is we're imitating a rigid box manufacturing technique. This is just going to be a mock-up, so I'm not going to wrap this with fabric and set it up as the actual finished product would be done. This is more of a design sample of the functionality because I have some unique functionality going on here. I do have another tutorial on just classic case-bound structures, rigid box structures that are made with wrapped fabric. This one's a little bit more involved because of the geometry. So this is just a mock-up to simulate that design. So this is I made this out of black material. I just used some black mounting board just to simulate what this might look like. So this is how this works. I have this outer component that slips down and then all these pieces fold out. So I have this unique geometry of all these four corners. And since the theme of the brand is time and place, obviously time, we're selling watches. And then I've kind of come up with this sort of a GPS global coordinate type feeling, almost like a compass. Some fake graphics in here, north, south, east, and west, and then these kind of triangular points. So it's alluding to compass direction, global navigation, and then we have the round component inside. So I want to talk about how to build these components, a little less about the branding and graphics, but more about the functionality and how the functionality of the box lends itself to the brand. So we have all these other pieces inside. So we have the watch wrapped around this oval component. I'm sort of imitating how classic watches are packaged. So we have this piece inside. I'm suggesting a little brochure that might be in there with a little picture of the globe and then the pages inside that would fit in below. And then this internal part. So we have this tube, which I'm going to talk about how to make. This is a bent lamination. I never really quite finished. These parts are still separate from one another. I left it in pieces in case I wanted to add some more graphic feeling or some color to this. But I want to show how to build all these parts. So we'll just keep this over here, keep this handy. So this is going to incorporate several different things to do. The easiest part is that the bottom tray. It's just a square tray. It's very simple. So I started with the whole theme of the package is a square. So I did a square bottom panel and I cut the rest of these pieces to fit around it. So this is about 60 thousandths thick black chipboard. It's a mounting board. I kept this very thin. I didn't want to go with anything too thick, like thick foam core or something like that would probably be a little bit too thick and be a little out of scale because this is a pretty small box. So I'm keeping this very thin. So I've got this box partially assembled. So what we do have to do is I have a square bottom, and what I want to do is I want to overlap my corners so I don't have that negative void in there. So I glued two panels exactly the same dimension as the bottom, but then I made these other two panels slightly larger. So when I glue them in position, they overlap the other pieces. So this is just your basic square tray. It's pretty straightforward to build. So I'm just going to finish this one up. Again, it's very thin material, so just a light bead on the edge. Much coverage as possible, because this is going to ooze out a little. And just laying this in position. I just use Elmer's glue. I don't like using hot melt glue guns because the material is a little bit too thick, especially for something this small. The glue tends to take up too much space when I use hot melt. So I'm just gonna use wet glue. The downside is it takes a moment to dry. So I'm gonna do this in several different steps. So that's it. So that's how I made the whole box. And I have these joints overlapping. So it's nice and clean in the corners. So that's the easy part. It's just a square tray. I have developed the drawings. All of this is coming from these layout drawings that I did in a 3D modeling program. That is another tutorial that comes before this of how to develop this geometry and figure out how all these panels are going to be made and how big everything is based on the product that's going to fit inside. So all of this is coming from these layout drawings. I'm just following these, sort of like a shop drawing. So this is a very different process. This is for a rigid box, a setup box. It's different than our folding cartons and our corrugated structures, which we're developing die lines and we're folding up the structure to create the functionality of that package. This is different. We're just building what we want. It's like going into a shop and building a birdhouse or a stool or something like that. We're just cutting out our panels and gluing them together. I'm not as concerned about die lines. Die lines and die cutting are used in rigid box setup structures, but that's more of a decision for the vendor and the manufacturer to do that. We're not imitating that process. We just want to create our design so we can show that to other people on the team. So that's the bottom part of the box. We have the these triangular components. I have these built in a variety of different degrees. So this also, I basically just built a square, just like on the bottom. And it's the exact same size as the bottom. I want to create the floors for all of these triangles. All these triangles are going to be exactly the same footprint as the square on the bottom. So I just took those, drew the diagonal on that and cut that into the diamond shapes and then started gluing the panels together. So this is a little trickier because I have these intersections here that are not 90 degrees, they're 45 degrees. So getting that intersection to lock in there nice and tight is a little trickier. So I glued this panel on first. I created the diamond shape, and that comes from the layout. The layout told me exactly how big that was going to be. And I glued that in there, and I have this piece of material sticking out just slightly. And I glued that in there and used that as a guide to keep this nice and square. So once I get all of these glued together, this part will be very strong because we do have some triangulation going on, and I have panels in our X, Y, and Z axes, so that makes that very strong. So I started with this panel, glued this corner panel on, and then glued the other panel. So what's happening here is these are exactly the same, but I have an overlap here in the corner. So I brought that one all the way up to the edge. This one needs to fit needs to fit inside of that. So there's a little bit too much material. So if I were to line that up, it's a little bit sticking out. So what has to happen, I have to remove a slight bit of material from that. So these are little nuances that I'm doing on the fly. So I'm gonna remove about 60 thousandths. I'm just gonna kind of estimate about how big that might be. And that's going to fit inside here. And when I do that, it's slightly higher because I have an angle. So I'm gonna sand that down after this is glued into position. So that part's right in there. So I can finish this part. So, so these are very small little pieces, so I'm just going to be very careful. Get that glue seam to fit, and then I'm just going to pivot that down into position. So what is nice is the wet glue allows you to get that into position before it completely dries, which it can be helpful. I keep little paper towel pieces around just to kind of pull the glue off. So I'm going to sand that down slightly off there in the corner. I'll sand that down later because all these triangles really need to fit nice and tight. So I'm using that as a guide. So I'm going to go in there since I have that little negative space in there because of the angles of that joint. I'm just going to put some glue in there. I'm just going to wipe that clean. Let that sort of sit and fill in that little area. Keep that nice and square. So that's how that is completed. So ultimately there'll be 4 of these. These are dried already. So I go back and just take a look. Like I had mentioned, there might be a little bit of sanding. So I'm just going to kind of even up that little intersection there in the corner, get those. I'm not just sanding just the corner, I'm actually sanding the whole part down. So it's a nice clean edge. Just a little bit, just to get that to line up. So that's nice and even. These little corners here are sticking up ever so slightly. So I'm not sanding the complete surface of the material. I don't want to scar that. I just want to sand this little end here. So I'm leaning in slightly just to clean that up. Bring that back. And I'm actually just going to take this little corner up because this will be a bit of a radius here. Doesn't need to be so sharp. So just cleaning that up, just so that fits nicely. Do that on all the corners. So once this piece is dried, it's quite strong because we do have this triangulation, so it's sticking up just a little bit. Do a little bit more there. Okay, so I'm using the black material because ultimately this, when this gets wrapped and it's in production, will be a semi-black woven type of material. So just by going with the black right away, it brings us that much closer to how this will look in production. So this one's got a little bit here. Just cleaning that up. I'm doing this now before I assemble this to the rest of the pieces because it'll be much more difficult to get in there to do that. Okay, so ultimately these are going to be hinging off of this area, and we're going to talk about how to create that hinge joint there also. So let's just put that to the side for a second, and let's start to build some of these internal components. So I do have this tube. This I had not glued into position. So this is just a piece cut with a hole in it. But this tube, it's a little different technique. I'm going to use a bent lamination technique to create that. So my diameter of this was a little bit flexible. I think when I did my layout, I had picked a dimension that this was going to be. So my layout, it's just about exactly what it is. So to do this bent lamination, what I'm going to be taking is some thinner box board material. It's still with this dead black. And it's about 50, it's like box board thickness, so maybe about 15,000, so it's pretty thin. And it's very flexible. These materials, when you do work with them, you'll see there is a bit of a grain. It wants to bend a little bit easier in one direction than another. So you can kind of, I just flex the board and I get a feel for how much it resists, so I kind of figure out what that grain is by doing that. And it helps just to make these bend a little bit easier. So I'm going to use a bent lamination process. So sometimes I'll encourage the material to flex a little bit. I'll take like a wooden dowel or something around, just sort of curling it slightly. Just kind of make it come around. So when I put it together, it doesn't want to resist too much. So I'm just doing that just a little bit to get that ready. So while I was doing this, quite often what I'll do is I'll take foam core or cardboard and I'll make a former. I'll cut circles, hold them together, and I'll wrap this material around it and tape it, and then I'll wrap other pieces with glue to create the bent lamination. So it just so happens that this diameter is very close to my Yeti cup. So I had this handy, so I checked that diameter on my drawing. I was like, wow, this would be perfect as my former. And you can do that. You could use a can of soup, or you could use anything that's around that's in a dowel shape. Now this is a perfect cylinder. I checked it with the square. It's not tapered, because tapered would make this very crooked. I want something that's perfectly straight. So for a bent lamination, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this thin material, I'm gonna bring it around like this, and just make a note of exactly where that is. And I'm gonna cut that down to that dimension. I'm just gonna square this up with my triangle. So now I know exactly how big that is. So what I'll do is bring this all the way around, and I'm gonna pull that in nice and tight so it meets and make that line up. I'm just gonna tape that together. That's nice and clean. So all I'm gonna do is put some glue on this and take other pieces of material and wrap it on top. So what I wanna do is I have this seam now, so that will be a weak point. So what I want to do, and I'm just going to bring this around and measure what the next layer would be. It's gonna be slightly bigger, so I'm not measuring all of these at the same time. I wanna keep track of each layer. It's gonna be a subtle difference because as these go around, the diameters and the lengths, actually the circumference of that will get larger. So I'm preparing this next layer to be put on here. So I'm gonna cut this to size. Like so this is now ready to go. I'm gonna curl it a little. This is quite a big diameter, so the curling on this might not be necessary, but when you get to smaller parts, it really helps quite a bit. So all I'm going to do is put some glue on this. Now this comes from woodworking techniques. They call this a bent lamination, where I'm taking material and I'm gluing it to thin layers. It really became popular with the Ames plywood chair, which is one of my favorite chairs, which is a bent lamination. So it's basically a plywood type of technique. So I'm getting a little bit of this glue on my cup, which is not good, but it will wash off. So I'm just gonna spread that out as much as I can, within reason. Now I'm gonna wrap this, I'm gonna look for the joint that I don't want to line up my joints. I kind of want to put them on opposite sides, so when they overlap one another, they will create reinforcement. So I need to bend this. I'm gonna try to line it up as best I can with that under layer that I have there. And bring that right around. And since I have the wet glue, I can really pull that in nice and tight. Try to get that. I can always sand and clean things up at the end of the process. And then I'll just put a piece of tape here to hold that down. That's nice and clean. So I'm going to do 3 layers. I'm going to just remove some of that glue from the cup. I can wash that off later. So then I'll do a 3rd layer. So what's happening, when this dries, this whole part will become very rigid and it'll stay in this circular form to a certain degree. So now I'm just measuring my 3rd layer, just stepping that slightly so I can see. Very hard to work with the black material, it's hard to see. It's not very reflective. Okay, that looks good. So again, this is called a bent lamination. So you can see how these pieces are changing in size as I go. The cutoff, they were all the same length, but as I go out further, I'm removing less material. So I'm not pre-measuring. I want to measure this as I go to see how these are going to fit. So I'm just going to do a double check. Okay, I got a little bit of space, but I'm going to pull that in tight. So even using this wet glue on the material, it does allow it to stretch slightly. You can see how loose that is getting. But as it dries, it's going to pull in even tighter. So I'm going to do that same process with this. I think these 3 layers will bring the thickness of this tube to just about where I need it. Just going to spread that out. So I have as much coverage as possible. It's nice. Now, with this kind of a mock-up, it's not as critical, but when you're building the furniture and doing bent laminations, you really want 100% coverage, so there's no voids. When you look at the edge, like if you look at the edge of an Ames chair, they do that really well. And they're actually doing compound curves when they make that chair. So there was my tape edge, so I'm going to do this on the opposite side. Try to get that to line up. Once you get it started, it should stay clean all the way around. And then again, at the very end here, I can move it into position. I'm squeezing that in. Get that to line up as best I can. So a little bit of a void there. Not too bad. That is because the material is stretching slightly. So I have a little bit of a void there. Pull that in as tight as I can. Now let's put that on there to keep that nice and clean. So I'm just going to take a look at my part. Not bad. Squeeze it together. I think I'll just wipe off some of the glue off of my Yeti former cup. Again, if you don't have something around that fits, you can make your own former out of cardboard or foam core. It's always a little easier to have one of these handy. So I'm just going to leave that like that and let that dry. So that'll be that tube component that goes on the inside. So we talked about the triangles. We have a couple of those ready. We have our square base. So we have this inside piece here. This is a little bit more complicated. This is the oval pad that the actual watch is going to be wrapped around. I'm just imitating how other watch boxes work. So again, I need to make that, and with the way I'm doing it is I had this other round component which helps center that into the that cylindrical part that we just made. So for expedience sake, I had this built in several different parts. So I started with this round area and I cut this off. This all comes from my layout, which came from the 3D file to discover this geometry. I created these ovals. It's a little hard to see the black. I cut them in half and made these parts and just glued it together. I made a little bit of a former in here. So this whole thing is like a former. Former being this internal ribbed structure that's going to create this pad part that we have here on the inside. So all I have to do is a similar process, that bent lamination. I'm gonna wrap some material around here and then glue it together. So I have that started. I just cut it to the width that I need first. And it's gonna be very similar to what I just did around the cup to do that. So did I measure this? No, okay. So I am going to start here on the flatter part of the curve, this flatter part. Now this is a little bit tighter, so using that wooden dowel to get this to form, it's very advisable at this point because I don't want this to start to crease. I really want to keep this curve nice and clean. So again, I'm going to pick this calculation right here, and I'm going to trim this part down. So when I wrap that on there, it's as close to center as possible. Okay, so I'm going to start here. Now I think what I'm going to do is I might just tape that to that center point. Now what I have to do is I have to get glue on all of these edges all at the same time. I could do it in stages, but let's try to do it all at once. It's going to be a little challenging. So I know I'm going to have a little piece of tape right in here, and I'm going to glue that, tape that to that center fin to hold that in position. So let's get that ready. So I did curl this with the wooden dowel. Don't want to ruin my piece of tape there. So this gets that to curl really nice, so it's ready to form. And I don't want it to resist too much because sometimes it's hard to hold that down into position. All right, so this will be the challenging part. I'm going to try to get glue on all of these edges all at the same time. Okay. So we call these formers. We're building this kind of internal rib structure to wrap this around. So this works really well just for 2D curves, not three-dimensional compound curves. That's a whole different story. In case-bound structures, quite often compound curves aren't part of what we're doing, but that's not absolute. It can be. We could use like pulp forming, we could use vacuum forming. There's other ways to get compound structures. This is just for 2D. So I'm going to try to hold this here. I'm going to start wrapping this. I'm using that center former as a guide. I'm just going to take that in there and then just wrap this around. And make sure I don't get my fingers on the glue as much as possible. Just going to wrap this right around as tight as I can and pull that right back to center. And I can clean off that glue. So try to make sure I'm pretty strong there. And then I'll just add another piece right here to hold that. And just clean that up. Since I am using a water base, Elmer's glue, sometimes a little bit of moisture to get some of the fingerprints off, but that's not bad. So that gives us this nice curved area that's going to work on there. And that's just one layer of material. And that's actually quite strong. By doing this curve and having all those formers in there, it's quite strong. I could actually just stop with that. I'm going to do one more because my geometry, I did allow for these layers when I took it off of my, my layout. I did allow for a little bit of a thicker wall. I wasn't sure how much I was going to need. So I think I'm going to add another piece to that. But I actually could do that later. That's quite strong. Let's see how close I am to my original part. Yeah, I have a little bit of extra clearance there. So let's do one more. Just to get, by just adding another layer, I'm just gonna do this in the opposite direction to make that nice and strong. So again, to prepare this, I'm going to curl it, roll it up a little bit, do from both edges. Now I don't have my center line. It's not as critical. I'm just kind of doing a little bit of a dry clamp here. Bring this around, make sure I'm pretty tight. Okay, I need to see my starting point. So again, I'm measuring right on here. Make sure that's pretty tight. So I know that's where I want to trim that. Okay. So I'm just going to do the same process. I don't have that center former as a guide, so I'm just going to get that on there. And I think what I might do is just draw a little pencil on here. Because if I don't lay this square, if I lay this slightly crooked like this, and I start wrapping, it's going to be all crooked. So I want to hang on to these center lines. I love center lines. That's actually slightly off there according to that, but that should be okay. So I'm going to bring this around and create that bent lamination effect. So now I'm not going to be putting glue on that. I can just put glue on this entire surface. Now, I don't want to do too much because this is a wet glue and it does tend to stretch the material out a little bit. It's like putting water on this. It would be, it makes it stretch out a little bit and get a little soft until it glues, but I don't want to affect my, so I'm just doing a little bit. Just kind of spread that out. Now, since I'm using such a thin layer, this is going to dry pretty quickly. So I just want to move along fast enough so I can get that into position before the glue starts to set up. Now, I can't see my, so the tape from the previous one is on this side, so I want to go on the opposite direction. So I'm going to use that center line as a guide. Just want to hold that. It's hard to hold. I'm going to hold on these outside pieces and hold this down here and then try to get that to bend around. And I'm using the shape as a guide. Bring that in nice and tight and then bring that right around to the other side. So that looks pretty good. Yeah, looks great. And we'll just use a piece of tape to hold that into position. All right, so that looks great. Yeah, nice and tight. So we have our nice, beautiful oval shape. Sorry about the black, it's a little hard to see. But we have that nice and wrapped. So this turned out really well. A lot better than the other one. The one I did originally, I used thinner material. It's a little bumpy and it's not as clean. But it was okay. It was to prove out the geometry. Again, this is a mock-up. I'm simulating what this functionality will be for a case-bound structure. Okay, so that's quite nice. So this particular one has, all I did was add these little feet, these little protrusions that sit down. So when this goes in there, it's stable and it's not rocking all over the place. So I'm just sort of cobbling this up to get this to work. This might not be, or probably will not be, exactly how this is going to be made in production. A design like this, once it gets proven out, everybody likes it, the team is on board, then I would meet with a vendor and we would start to talk about how to produce this. Get a little bit of a gap there. That's fine. We would discuss production techniques. Now, sometimes, as a designer, I like to push the envelope. I want to do something interesting. I want this to be engaging, and I like these shapes and things like that. It really works for the brand, or it's just a unique opening experience. And then when I go to the vendors, sometimes they look at me like, you're crazy. And I'm like, well, not really crazy, just motivated. So sometimes we need to negotiate, and then they'll say, well, what do you really need to do here? And then we'll talk and hash out things. And quite often, basically, you can do anything you want as long as you pay for it, and it costs. So with that in mind, it's like, okay, I want this particular functionality. What does that cost? Because, wow, that's going to be 3 times expensive, more expensive than a more traditional approach. So then it's a negotiation. And sometimes we go back and forth, and I'll go back to the rest of the design team and say, well, this is going to be expensive and this is cheaper, and we will negotiate all of that. But I'd like to try to stay with the original design that we have and try to get that to work. Okay, so this part is just about ready, and that's going to go inside. So we have this part. We have our square tray. This is ready to go. We have the tube that is drying, and that looks pretty good. See, I only did, I did 3 layers there. So this is a little bit thinner than my original, which can be okay. So we'll see how that works. And then we have our triangular pieces. So the height of this part, when it's mounted inside here in the center, is part of the supports for these outside triangles. So all of that was discovered in the 3D file. So I'm making these parts based on everything I had engineered in that 3D file. So again, this little edge is slightly off, so just sand these down, get that nice and clean. Most of the sanding is just for edges and intersections. I'll never, not never, but most often will not sand surfaces, because those are relatively clean, and it is box board, so we don't want to tear up those nice clean surfaces. With these edges, it's nice to keep those clean. So I have a little bit of a step here, so I'm just gonna smooth that out a little. So again, this is patience, craftsmanship. I'm sort of wearing a different hat now. I'm in craftsmanship mode, in building mode, not so much in design mode. So this just takes a little bit of patience. Don't want to rush through this. I want this to be a very nice presentation of the design. We want everybody to look at the design. We don't want the craftsmanship to get in the way. It's quite often, if it's not made well and it looks off, sometimes we'll have discussions about how things are made, and we don't want to do that. We want to talk about the design. Okay, so this is ready to go. So there is a little bit of dry time when you're using wet glue, but you get really nice, clean geometric shapes. Okay, so I'm going to put that back over there. So I set up these components. Let's see, is this even going to fit on this one? Yeah, it might. Yeah, so let's use that. It fits on both of these. Okay. So I'm going to make this other part that fits on. Let's see if this even fits in here. Yeah, it does. Very good. So I'm making these very accurate. It's handmade, so I'm trying to interchange a lot of these pieces. So we have this part with the hole in it that's going to go in here. So all I did was cut another square piece. I don't need to go through right now, but I just cut the circle in there that will fit around our inside tube that we have. So let's just see if I can assemble this. This part was from the other one, and that fits pretty well. So I set up a lot of these pieces so I can do a live tutorial in class about how this is going to work. And this is the box tray that we have at the bottom. And this should fit in here. And it does. So I didn't glue a lot of these together like I had mentioned. I'm not sure, I might do some more graphic components. And I'm not sure if I want to set this panel down and have like a little reveal here. And maybe there's some art on there, or maybe there's some color or art on the tube. Not sure. So I'm leaving these pieces unglued. But since they're made very accurately and they fit together nicely, I can leave them like this. That's friction fit and that's secure in there. So let's see if this is, oh, that fits nicely. Wow. Okay, great. Nice little amount of play. The other one that I had, the original, I think it was a little bit of a tight, oh, that's not bad either. Okay, so that's working well. I think the thickness of this wall is quite different than the original one I made. It was a little thicker. So that actually gives me a little bit more clearance, which is probably a better fit anyhow. Okay, so that's that part that fits inside, that'll hold the watch. So the other part is these 4 hinging triangles. So let's just take a look and see. Okay, that's sitting nice and square there. That's perfect, excellent. So let's just talk about hinging. So all I did was I took some of this thin board that I used to create the bent laminations and just center line. So this is built the size to fit all the way. I have 1.5 inches here, 1.5, so I got the 3 inches and I got my center line. So I'm actually gonna glue this right to this part to create this hinge. And that's how they do it in production. A lot of the lids are hinged by just using the wrap material. Since I'm not wrapping this, I'm going to use this material. So I have several of these cut up, and I did use my scoreboard from our boxboard construction. So that would be the same process. I'm gonna create that little bead. We all know what that is at that point. We don't want to tear the material, and I don't want to partially cut it. I want this to be very strong. So I'm gonna use my scoreboard to create this little bead on here. Again, the bead comes up on the inside and it rolls nice on the outside. So I'm gonna just set this up and hyperextend that fold, get that really nice and clean on center. So that's good. So that's how these were made. And there are 4 of them per structure. So what has to happen is this has to be glued to here. And I'm gonna glue it to the side of this. And I'm gonna have my bead here because this is gonna be the inside of the fold. And this is how this whole structure is going to be contained. And again, 4 times around. So now it's just a matter of decision about how I'm going to glue this. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm gonna do one at a time and just be as careful as possible. I want that to be right on center. Okay, so I'm checking that, that looks good. I'm gonna glue that to here. So all I have to do is surface glue, surface mount. That on here. Staying a little bit away from the edges because it does kind of ooze out and it gets a little messy. But we want it to be as tight as possible so that hinge will work exactly in that orientation. So I'm going to place this in position. Since it's wet glue, I can put it down and move it around a little bit and double check my clearances. Try to keep the glue from oozing out as much as possible. So I'm checking my clearance for the hinge. That looks nicely centered. Okay, I'm going to continue pressing that down. So it's nice with this, using this material. Whether I made the box all white or all black or even a color, we use all the same color, we can get this to look essentially seamless. So it is quite wet, and it's going to take a moment for that to dry. So let's just put that down for a second. I'm going to press that and squeeze out all the glue. Make sure it has a nice surface contact. My fold is right on center there, so that looks good. That looks nice. If you line those seams up perfectly with those edges, it's almost hard to tell that it is a separate part. It almost looks like it's all one piece. So if this was wrapped with our overwrap, which we're just simulating, this would be part of the overwrap. And sometimes they'll use a reinforcing tape in the hinge and then wrap over that reinforcing tape to make those hinges so they're nice and strong. Because this is a case bound, it's a relatively expensive product, so we want those hinges to hold up. We don't want them to tear. So this needs to last a reasonable amount of time. It's funny, when you get involved with rigid packages and case bound, it kind of begs the question if it's a package or if it's a product. I have some other tutorials on spirits bottles, case bound structures, and they're made out of wood. So then you get involved with cabinetry, and it's like, is it a package anymore or is it part of the product? So when you get involved with this higher end luxury type packaging, you know, rigid and case bound, sometimes they're quite nice and they're quite permanent. It's almost not a package, because sometimes you think of a package as something that might be disposable. You might throw it away. Okay, so that looks secure. I want to make sure that that's on. I want that to move when I go into the next step. So what I want to do now is I want to glue this to this surface, and I want to make sure that my geometry is lining up. So part of this is I'm sorry, I was off camera. So part of this is having this hinge around and it rests on the tube. So from orthographic projection, which I laid out on my drawing, I have that all figured out. So that's why this tube is a certain height and it's very specific. That supports that. So the watch sits in the center, all four of these triangles come in, so any kind of downward pressure, it's very strong and very secure. But then it also has this beautiful geometry which alludes to our brand. So it's a nice integration of brand and structural geometry. So this looks like it's ready to go. I'm just going to do this once because it just happens 4 times all around. So the next step is to take that off, and I'm just going to glue this to this section right here. I'm going to spread that out because it was like a little bit too wet. So by spreading this out, I'm also kind of removing some of it. You don't need a lot. Because the other one I did, it took a little while for that to dry. So pull it away from the edges slightly because it will come out. So that's just about how clean to try to make this. So I'm going to lay this piece right on here. And by testing that, I know that this is sitting down. Very nice. So if I'm just very careful and get this right into position, everything should work fine. So that's how to build, let's call it a living hinge. When you get involved with injection molding and vacuum forming, when you integrate a hinge into the material, they quite often, they'll call it, look at that. Oh, that's nice. Nice and square. Excellent. They call it a living hinge because it's coming out of the material. It's integral. It's not like a mechanical hinge, which is like a hinge on a door. That's mechanical. It's separate parts. It has a pin. You screw it in. That's more mechanical hinge. So living hinge refers to an integrated hinge into the material. So this would be equivalent to a living hinge for a boxboard construction. So that's nice. It's very clean. And if I was careful, I should be able to do all 4 of these. Now, since I have that nice little bead in there, when this is completely open, I know it's going to be hard to see, there is a slight gap in here because of that bead. That gap is perfect because that allows my outer label sleeve that I have in here to sit in there. So when this is open, there's a little bit of space for that to fit. So it's like a a little bit of a tolerance in there. It's not quite perfect. These hinges were a little stiffer. I'm using a different board to try to get the hinges to sit down. Ultimately, we can control this in a case bound. So when these come down, they sit nice and flat. These are popping up a little bit, which is not bad. It still has an interesting unboxing experience. Okay, so this is lifting up a little, so make sure that's coming down. As the glue dries, sometimes it lifts up a little bit, so you gotta keep after that. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so that'll happen 4 times. This part fits inside. It'll be similar to this. I'm not gonna take the watch off, but these are almost identical parts. So wrap the product around that, and then that fits into the center. So then when these come up, it sits right on top and it sits above the watch and it's not sitting on the bezel. So that's nice and clean. Okay, so then that gets back to this outer sleeve. I just used some box board. Since this is a semi-permanent type of structure, I could use a more substantial material here, a thicker material, even another wrapped piece of material, because that is carrying our branding. So there could be some really nice detailing going on there. And that's integrating with the brand approach. I'm making up this brand, so it's completely fake, but this lends itself to being brand-centric for the structure. And you pull that up, now you have this nice strong box. Any downward pressure on here is very strong and it's protecting the product. So that's basically how to build, this is a mock-up of a case-bound structure. I'm not wrapping this with any fabric, but I just want to communicate the structure. I have other tutorials on a spirits box, and I also have a tutorial on a basic case-bound tray where I actually wrap it with fabric and material so we can see how that structure is done. Okay, so that's it for this one. Thank you.